How did one of the greatest cities in history rise and fall? What is the story behind the Tower of Babel? And how does Babylon appear in the Bible? Let's break it down step by step. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to Logic Relic. Part 1. The Origins and Early Rise of Babylon. Babylon appeared on the historical stage quite late in this region, around the transition between the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Before that, a small settlement had existed there since the end of the 4th millennium BCE. But for a long time, it had little significance. The name Babylon is the Greek version of the Akkadian word Babili, meaning gate of the god. This Akkadian term derives from an older Sumerian term, Pabilsak, also translated as gate of the god. The first historical records of Babylon appear from the decline of the Akkadian state, under the reign of the last king, Shar-Kali-Sheri, great-grandson of Sargon the Great. At that time, Babylon was still just a small town without political importance in Mesopotamia. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the city fell under the control of the 3rd dynasty of Ur and became a provincial administrative center, managed by officials dispatched from there. Babylon had a particularly advantageous geographical position, located between the two rivers Tigris and Euphrates, right at the intersection of trade routes and irrigation canals, and at the boundary between two cultural and political worlds, Sumer in the south and Akkad in the north. This created ideal conditions for future development. However, for a long time, Babylon remained in the shadow of stronger city-states in Mesopotamia. At the end of the 21st century BCE, the 3rd dynasty of Ur collapsed under attacks from Amorite tribes in the north and Elamites in the south. In 2004 BCE, the Elamite king Kendatus sacked it, and Mesopotamia fell into a period of fragmentation. City-states regained independence and began competing for control of land, canals, and trade routes. Ur, Larsa, Eshnunna, Nippur, and others vied for dominance. In this context of competition, Babylon finally had the opportunity to step out of the shadows. In 1894 BCE, the Amorite leader Sumuabum seized power in the city. From this point, Babylon became politically independent. It was not yet strong enough to challenge the leading cities in the region like Larsa or Ur, but it maintained its autonomy and gradually grew stronger. Its rise was supported by an efficient administrative system inherited from the Ur period and its strategic location. In 1792 BCE, Hammurabi, the 6th king of the first Babylonian dynasty, ascended the throne. At that time, Babylon was still just one of many Amorite city-states in southern Mesopotamia. Its position was stable, but the city was still a secondary power. Regional dominance belonged to Larsa, which controlled vast territories extending to Ur, while Ur had previously lost its influence. In the northeast, the states of Eshnunna and Mari held power, while in the north, Assyria was beginning to rise. In this political context, Hammurabi launched campaigns that ultimately transformed Babylon into the capital of the greatest kingdom of that era. Hammurabi inherited a solid bureaucratic system and a stable economy from his predecessors. In the early years of his reign, he focused on consolidating internal power. He repaired the irrigation system, brought order to the provinces, and reorganized the tax system. These efforts strengthened royal authority and created an economic foundation for future expansion. The true transformation of the Babylonian kingdom began in the middle of Hammurabi's reign. In 1763 BCE, he defeated Larsa, capturing it along with Uruk and other important cities in the south, leaving Babylon without rivals in the region. Then, he turned his attention to the north and east. Eshnunna, which had long maintained independence and had close ties with Elam, was conquered in 1761 BCE. At the same time, war broke out with the kingdom of Mari in the middle Euphrates. Ultimately, Hammurabi's armies captured and sacked Mari, and its territory was annexed into the kingdom. After these victories, Babylon rose to dominate southern Mesopotamia and much of the north. Hammurabi's rule extended from the Persian Gulf to the middle Euphrates, covering key agricultural lands and commercial centers of the region. He managed this vast territory through a network of appointed governors, controlling canals, trade routes, and markets, ensuring stability and redirecting wealth to the capital. Under Hammurabi, Babylon developed into the political and religious center of the region. Marduk, the city's patron god, was elevated to the highest position in the Sumer-Akkad pantheon. The king of Babylon was not only seen as a ruler, but also as the earthly representative of the supreme god, carrying out the god's will. Part 2. Society, Law, and Myths during Hammurabi's time. Babylonian society was divided into three main classes. At the top were the Awilim, free landowners who could defend their interests in court and participate in political and public life. They were mainly nobles, wealthy landowners, merchants, and the military elite. Below them were the Muskanum, literally those who bowed down, a class without land and without full citizenship rights. They typically rented land from the court or temples and had to pay a portion of the harvest in return. However, they could own personal property and bring lawsuits to court, though with limitations. For example, the testimony of an Awilim carried more weight than that of a Muskanum, and the punishment for the same crime would be harsher for the latter. Initially mainly farmers, over time, Muskanum also included royal officials, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the wardum, slaves with no rights whatsoever. People became slaves through capture as prisoners of war, unpaid debts, or punishment for crimes. Slaves could belong to the king, temples, or even private individuals. Slaves had no personal property and were considered property that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, or rented. If a free person injured a slave, it was only seen as damage to someone else's property, and the offender only needed to compensate. In addition to the social hierarchy, family relationships and economic roles also shaped Babylonian society. The family followed a patriarchal model, with the man as the head of the household and having nearly absolute rights over its members. Women, especially from the upper class, had some property rights. They could own land, serve as priestesses, and even run businesses. However, they still remained under male authority. Priests and priestesses involved in the worship of Marduk and other gods held a special status. They were respected and often exempt from taxes and duties. Hammurabi's greatest legacy was his Code of Laws, the most famous and best-preserved collection of legislation from ancient Mesopotamia. It was inscribed on a black diorite stele and placed in the center of the capital so that everyone could see the laws governing the state. In the prologue, Hammurabi declares that he received these laws from the god Marduk to establish justice on earth, to destroy the wicked and injustice, and to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. This declaration emphasizes the divine nature of royal power and presents the law as an extension of divine will. For a long time, this code was thought to be the first law code in history, though we now know that is not true. Hammurabi's code addressed almost every aspect of life: commerce, agriculture, family matters, crimes, court procedures, and property disputes. But the laws were not applied equally. Punishments depended on the social status of both the offender and the victim. For example, a free person might only be fined for an offense, while a slave could be executed for the same crime. The victim's status also mattered. Killing a slave was considered a minor offense, while killing an Awilim was a serious crime. Many laws followed the principle of an eye for an eye, especially when both parties were of the same rank. At the same time, the code also provided social protections with provisions safeguarding widows, orphans, and tenant farmers, as well as regulating debts and working conditions. Hammurabi's code established the idea of royal power as something transcending personal interests, aimed at protecting public order. It was a tool for centralized control, bringing society under a single code backed by the authority of both king and god. This legal system became the foundation for Babylon's stability during Hammurabi's reign. One of the most enduring associations with Babylon is the notion of temple prostitution. Even in ancient times, the city was seen as a place of luxury and excess. The Greek historian Herodotus, for example, claimed that every woman in Babylon had to, at least once in her life, offer herself to a stranger in the temple of the goddess Ishtar. Later, biblical authors picked up on this theme, portraying Babylon as a symbol of sin and depravity, creating the lasting image of Whore of Babylon. However, historical reality is much more complex. There is no archaeological evidence that organized temple prostitution ever existed in Babylon. What Herodotus described as a religious ritual is now considered by most scholars to be an exaggeration or misunderstanding of local customs. Mesopotamian texts do mention priestesses of Ishtar, including the Kadishtu, women who may have participated in fertility rites. But whether those rites involved literal sexual acts is highly debatable. It seems that ritual sexuality in the cults of Ishtar and other goddesses was symbolic, expressed through ceremonies, music, dance, or perhaps theatrical performances. However, Greek authors interpreted these traditions through the lens of Eastern decadence. In that sense, temple prostitution, as we commonly imagine it, is more myth than fact, though it is a persistent myth that contributed to Babylon's reputation as a city of sin. Part 3. Decline after Hammurabi, the Kassite period, and Assyrian domination. After Hammurabi's death in 1750 BCE, the throne passed to his son, Samsaluna. He inherited a vast empire, but holding it together proved much harder than expanding it. On the surface, Babylon still appeared strong. But under Samsaluna, the first cracks began to appear. The economy was strained by his father's endless wars and began to collapse. Southern cities like Uruk, Ur, and Larsa soon rebelled, with Nippur resisting most fiercely. Ultimately, southern Mesopotamia slipped from Babylon's control and began moving toward independence. The north brought new troubles. Assyria, once dependent on Babylon, grew increasingly strong. At the same time, Kassite tribes from the Zagros Mountains began appearing in the records. Initially mercenaries, raiders, and minor troublemakers. Their raids were sporadic at first, but gradually they settled in the northeast. They built strongholds and began participating in Babylonian governance. The names of Samsaluna's successors are not recorded, and their reigns left few traces. The scarcity of sources is a sign of decline, both political and cultural. By the mid-17th century BCE, Babylon's power had fragmented. The kingdom's territory shrank, local lords acted independently, and the weakened state opened the door to new powers in the north. First Eshnunna, then Mitanni, and later the Hittites. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittite king Mursalai I launched a surprise invasion into Babylonian territory. He swept through northern Mesopotamia and attacked Babylon directly. The city fell. The Hittites looted and killed the last king of the Amorite dynasty, Samsuditana. This blow was a disaster for the old Babylonian kingdom. Central authority collapsed. The administrative system disintegrated. Many priests and nobles were killed, while others fled. Cities were abandoned, and fields were devastated. But the Hittites did not stay. After seizing the spoils, they withdrew to Anatolia, leaving a political vacuum in Mesopotamia. Into this vacuum stepped the Kassites. Babylon was too weak to resist, and the Kassites quickly took the city. However, instead of looting or destroying further, they chose to build on existing institutions for their own purposes. This moment marked the beginning of a new era in Babylonian history. The early decades of the Kassite dynasty were a transitional period. Old Babylonian institutions continued to function while the Kassite elite gradually integrated into the government. The new kings adopted the Akkadian language and Babylonian religion, maintaining the existing administrative system and relying on the old Amorite nobility. These choices ensured their legitimacy for centuries. Early rulers, like Agum II and his successors, rebuilt temples and returned the statue of the god Marduk, taken by the Hittites, to Babylon. This was a powerfully symbolic act, reinforcing both continuity and sacred ties. The Kassite dynasty became the longest in Babylonian history, lasting over 4 centuries until the 12th century BCE. It was a period of relative stability and growing international influence. Kassite kings pursued an active foreign policy, maintaining relations with Egypt, the Hittites, Elam, and Assyria. Surviving correspondence between Babylon and the pharaohs of Egypt's 18th dynasty shows the rulers addressing each other as equals, the great kings of the era. These exchanges indicate that Babylon was seen as one of the main power centers in the late Bronze Age world. By the end of the 13th century BCE, Babylon began to decline. Assyria grew stronger and gradually pushed Babylon out of its leading role. At the century's end, under the reign of Castiliash IV, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I delivered a decisive blow. defeating the Kassites, capturing and sacking Babylon. Most of the Babylonian nobility was taken prisoner, and Castiliash himself was brought to Ashur. This was the first time Babylon fell into Assyrian hands. Tukulti-Ninurta proclaimed himself king and tried to rule through governors, but his control quickly collapsed. Rebellions broke out in Babylon, and in Assyria, he was assassinated in a coup, plunging the kingdom into chaos. The Kassite dynasty was restored, but its strength was irreparably broken. The final blow came in 1155 BCE when the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahani captured Babylon, carrying off the god's statues, including Marduk, to Susa and completely ending the Kassite dynasty. After the fall of the Kassite dynasty and the destruction of Babylon by the Elamites, southern Mesopotamia fell into chaos. Rival dynasties and warlords vied for power while Assyria, now a great empire, began intervening more and more in the affairs of weakened Babylonia. The real turning point came under Tiglath-Pileser III, who advanced south in a systematic expansion campaign. He formally brought Babylon under his rule, allowing its kings to retain their titles, but in reality turning them into vassals. Under his successors, Assyrian control tightened. Rebellions were suppressed, disloyal rulers deposed, and governors loyal to Ashur appointed in their place. Babylon remained a respected religious center, but politically, it lived under continuous Assyrian domination. In 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III proclaimed himself king of Babylon, ending even the pretense of independence. His successors, including Sargon II and especially Sennacherib, treated Babylon without any respect for its autonomy. In 689 BCE, after another rebellion, Sennacherib attacked the city, completely destroying it and diverting the Euphrates to flood the area, attempting to erase Babylon from memory. This destruction shocked all of Mesopotamia, as Babylon was still seen as one of the holiest centers. The harsh treatment of Babylon caused instability even within Assyria itself. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, tried to repair it symbolically by restoring the city. He rebuilt Babylon, restored the worship of Marduk, and sought to balance power between Nineveh and Babylon. To maintain peace between the empire's two main centers, Esarhaddon divided power during his lifetime. His son, Ashurbanipal, became king of Assyria, while another son, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, was appointed king of Babylon. On paper, this arrangement promised stability, but in reality, it only sowed the seeds of new conflict. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, raised in Babylonian traditions, held the royal title but had no real power. Assyria still controlled the army, treasury, and all major decisions. In 652 BCE, Shamash-Shum-Ukin openly rebelled. He rallied the southern cities, gaining support from the Chaldeans, Arabs, and Arameans, even allying with Elam and Egypt. It was a bold, desperate effort to restore Babylon's independence. For several years, fierce war raged, but the odds never favored Babylon. Ashurbanipal brought the full might of Assyria, besieged Babylon, and in 648 BCE, captured the city. The failure of the rebellion dealt another heavy blow to Babylon's autonomy. From then on, Ashurbanipal imposed direct rule, appointing Babylonian kings himself. In the second half of the 7th century BCE, Assyria, which had long dominated the Near East, began to decline. Years of endless wars, rebellions, and internal strife had drained its strength. After Ashurbanipal's death, the empire fragmented into competing power centers, each struggling for control. For Babylon, this was the moment to rise again. In 626 BCE, the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar led a rebellion and expelled Assyrian garrisons from Babylon. He was proclaimed king, marking the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In a short time, he consolidated southern Mesopotamia, gained the support of the local nobility, strengthened his rule, and prepared for the decisive confrontation with Assyria. The key to victory was his alliance with the Medes. Around 615 BCE, the Median king Cyaxares attacked from the east, while Nabopolassar advanced from the south. In 614 BCE, Ashur, the old Assyrian capital, fell. And in 612 BCE, the Babylonian and Median armies attacked Nineveh. The city was completely destroyed, and Assyria's last great king, Sinsharishkan, was killed in the battle. From the ruins of the Assyrian Empire, Babylon once again emerged as the leading power in Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's reign marked the rebirth of the city as an independent force and the beginning of a new era in which Babylon stood among the great nations of the ancient Near East. Part 4. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, Final Decline, and Conclusion. After Nabopolassar's death in 605 BCE, the throne passed to Nebuchadnezzar II. Under his reign, the Neo-Babylonian Empire reached the height of its power. In the early years, Nebuchadnezzar conducted campaigns across the Levant, bringing city after city under his control and consolidating dominance. In 597 BCE, he besieged Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim of Judah surrendered and was deposed. Nebuchadnezzar exiled most of Judah's nobility along with the temple elite, military leaders, and skilled craftsmen to Babylon. On Judah's throne, he placed Zedekiah as a vassal. But just a few years later, Zedekiah allied with Egypt and tried to escape Babylonian rule. The response was swift. In 588 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar launched a second siege of Jerusalem. The city held out for nearly 2 years, but in 586 BCE, the Babylonians broke through, and Jerusalem fell. The Temple of Solomon, the central holy site of Judaism, was destroyed. The royal palace was burned, and the city walls were razed to their foundations. Zedekiah was captured while trying to flee. His eyes were gouged out, and he was led in chains to Babylon. The people were exiled, an event remembered as the Babylonian exile. Along with military campaigns, Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into the greatest city of the era. He launched an unprecedented building program. At the center was the Temple of Marduk, Esagila. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and expanded this sacred complex, decorating it with cedar wood, gold, and precious stones. The temple was a symbol of both religion and politics. During the New Year festival, the king would perform rituals confirming his rule as Marduk's chosen. Looming over the city was the ziggurat Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Nearly 90 meters tall, this massive step tower was said to be where Marduk descended. Many consider Etemenanke the inspiration for the Tower of Babel in the Bible, though some opinions point to other candidates like Babylon's Great Ziggurat. Babylon's defensive system was no less impressive. Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city with 2 walls separated by a moat. The outer wall was nearly 7 meters thick, and the main gate, the Ishtar Gate, was glazed with deep blue bricks and decorated with images of lions, bulls, and dragons, sacred animals of Marduk and Ishtar. From this gate ran the processional way, paved with stone and lined with lion reliefs, the route for grand ritual processions leading into the city center. The king also built a magnificent palace on the east bank of the Euphrates. The complex included living quarters, throne room, archives, and service buildings. Tradition holds that this was the site of the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis, was a Median princess raised in the cool mountain climate. She was uncomfortable with Babylon's heat and desert dust. So, the king ordered the creation of lush terraced gardens with fountains and trees thriving in a humid environment. Later traditions sometimes called them the Gardens of Semiramis. But in reality, Semiramis was the Greek way of recounting the name of the Assyrian queen Shemuramat, who lived centuries earlier and had no connection to the gardens. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for over 40 years. His reign was the zenith of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He consolidated Babylon's military dominance and left the empire's greatness imprinted on the city's very landscape. Nebuchadnezzar II was succeeded by Marduk, who ruled only 2 years before being overthrown by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, a powerful general. Neriglissar reigned until 556 BCE, when the throne passed to his young son, Marduk. The boy's reign was even shorter. He was assassinated in a court conspiracy. In the 6 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon saw 3 kings ascend and fall, each overthrown by violent coups. The dynasty's power was severely shaken, and the kingdom's stability began to weaken. In 556 BCE, Nabonidus seized power, a notable and still enigmatic figure. He was not of royal blood, but perhaps an official or general connected to the priesthood. His reign is most remembered for a bold religious reform. Nabonidus tried to push back the worship of Marduk to favor the moon god Sin. This angered the Babylonian priesthood and severely undermined his legitimacy, as royal power in Babylon was inseparably tied to the worship of Marduk. One of the greatest sources of discontent was that Nabonidus spent most of his reign away from Babylon. He left the capital and settled in Tema, an oasis in northern Arabia, where he focused on protecting trade routes and controlling caravan traffic. In his absence, power in Babylon was left to his son, Belshazzar, remembered in the Bible. The king's prolonged absence was seen as both political weakness and a violation of sacred order, as he could not perform traditional rituals for Marduk outside the city. Meanwhile, to the east, the Persian Empire was rapidly rising under Cyrus the Great. He had conquered Media, Urartu, and Lydia, and now turned his eyes to Babylon. In 539 BCE, the Persian army crossed the Tigris and began advancing. Nabonidus tried to organize resistance, but the Babylonian army had lost morale. The decisive battle took place near the city of Opis, where the Babylonian forces were completely defeated. Babylon did not fall by storm. Both Babylonian and Greek sources say the city surrendered without fighting. According to one version, the Persians diverted the river and entered through the dry riverbed. According to another, the gates were opened by Babylonian nobles dissatisfied with Nabonidus. Nabonidus himself was captured, while Belshazzar likely perished. Cyrus entered the city as a liberator, sparing the temples, preserving the worship of Marduk, and showing reverence for the local gods. He proclaimed himself king of Babylon, king of all lands, and the priesthood officially accepted his rule. Thus, in 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended. It lasted less than a century, but in that short time, it became one of the most splendid and powerful states in the ancient Near East. Babylon became one of the great cities in the Achaemenid Empire, one of 5 capitals and the site of the royal treasury. However, over time, its role began to change. The empire's administrative center shifted to Persepolis and Susa. Babylon remained wealthy and culturally vibrant, but its political influence gradually declined. It still held an important place in the bureaucracy. However, increasingly, it functioned as a regional center rather than the heart of the empire. In 331 BCE, after defeating the Persians at Gaugamela, Alexander the Great entered Babylon. The city surrendered without resistance. He was welcomed as Babylon's new king and, like Cyrus 2 centuries earlier, deliberately respected local traditions. He ordered the restoration of the Asagila temple and began ambitious plans to rebuild the city. Alexander intended to make Babylon the capital of his world empire, but he only spent the last few months of his life there. And in 323 BCE, he died in Babylon, leaving his vision unfinished. After Alexander's death, Babylon fell to the Seleucids, one of the strongest Greek dynasties. Initially, Seleucus I used the city as an administrative center, but soon he founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. That decision marked a turning point. Babylon's economic and administrative functions were transferred away, and the city quickly lost importance. For a time, the temples continued to function, and priests kept cuneiform chronicles, but the region's cultural and political center had shifted elsewhere. In the following centuries, Babylon gradually declined. Under the Parthians, it lay deep in the empire's interior and carried no political weight. Cuneiform writing gradually disappeared, and the old priestly schools closed. By the 1st century BCE, Greek and Roman writers described Babylon as nearly deserted, with ruined temples, silted canals, and fields overgrown with weeds. By the time the Arabs conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE, all that remained of Babylon was ruins. Local people quarried bricks from the ancient temples for building materials. The name Babylon survived, but only as a legend, not as a living city. Thus ends the story of Babylon, a city that over 2 millennia rose from a provincial settlement to an imperial capital, only to sink back into the sands of the Euphrates. Once again, if you've watched to the end of this video, we truly appreciate it if you like and subscribe. We have a whole team behind us, and we're thrilled to see you joining us on our journey to explore ancient civilizations. Thank you. You can also leave a special thank you below if you want to give us a little extra motivation. That really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.